Wait, so are Filipinos Hispanic?
This is a more or less complicated question. If you haven't watched the first part of this series, I'll leave a link somewhere in this video and suggest you do before watching this one. But back to the question that I cannot really give an answer to because there are many things that make up a Filipino. It goes without saying that the Philippines did have its own history with Spain and Spanish culture, and it began like many other stories of how Western Europe got their colonies. Spain wanted spices.
Se dirigen a la destrucción del hombre por el hombre. Estas dos.
Portuguese navigator Ferdinand Magellan guided the Spanish ships to look for an alternative route to Spice Islands, a nickname given to the eastern islands of Indonesia. But instead, they arrived in Cebu in 1521. It was Spanish explorer Ruy Lopez de Villalobos who gave the Philippines its predecessor name, Las Islas Filipinas, in honor of King Charles V's firstborn son, Philip, in 1542. Many Spanish voyages to the Philippines have been made since, but it wasn't until the next 50 years since their first arrival that their expeditions would be met with resistance from the indigenous people who were living in these islands. Spanish navigator Miguel Lopez de Legaspi was ordered to establish the first Spanish settlement by taking over a formerly Muslim territory within the islands. This territory became Intramuros, a walled city that is now known as modern-day Manila.
At this point of Filipino history, more and more Spanish officials, missionaries, and soldiers settled in the new colony. They used similar tactics of colonization in the Philippine Islands as they did in America, particularly New Spain, or as we now know it today as Mexico. This explains why there is such a striking similarity between Filipino and Mexican culture. Their history was almost parallel to one another.
Spanish missionaries sought to evangelize the inhabitants and reform their lifestyle towards Roman Catholicism. They even pushed the idea of Spanish customs as superior to the various indigenous cultures and belief systems already established in the islands.
Una gran parte de la población de las ciudades principales se había educado en español, gracias a la instrucción pública iniciada casi medio siglo antes.
Furthermore, the missionaries only spoke in Spanish when communicating and teaching their religious belief with the natives. This instilled the Spanish language in most early Filipino languages and helped expand the Catholic faith, which would eventually become the dominant religion practiced in the Philippines.
If we look at the Philippines today, it is the only predominantly Catholic country in Southeast Asia. About 80% of us are Catholic, and most families plan their child's baptism and which buffet to hold a reception at by the time they're born.
The Spaniards thought that converting them to their religion and culture would unify the 7,641 islands into one state, ideally a Hispanic one. However, there were so many civilizations in the archipelago that made it incredibly difficult to organize it all under Spanish rule.
During this historical era, the indigenous people suffered mass rapes, slavery, and brutality under the Spanish rule. Despite Spain's violent attempt to completely reform the indigenous communities, many early Filipino languages are still being used today, including Cebuano, Ilocano, Tagalog, and many more. But a new caste system emerged, one that would separate all inhabitants of the Philippines and create an even bigger class disparity based on race and wealth.
At the top of this social structure were the Peninsulares, the Spaniards that settled in the Philippines, and at the bottom were the natives referred to as Indios. Following the Peninsulares were their Filipino-born descendants called the Insulares. Right after were the Filipinos, those who are of mixed Indio and Spanish descent. Almost at the bottom were the Chinese mestizos, people who were either of Spanish or Filipino-Chinese descent. And just before the Indios were the mainland Chinese immigrants. However, one person fought for the equal treatment of all castes living in the colony. He suggested they be all referred to simply as Filipinos in hopes of dismantling the division between those who benefited or were oppressed from the caste system. This person was Jose Protasio Rizal, who would later on be one of the most prominent Filipino figures and even be recognized as the national hero of the Philippines.
Consumatum est.
His novels became Filipino literary classics. Noli Me Tangere, which translates from Latin to Touch Me Not in English, and El Filibusterismo criticized and denounced Spain's colonial rule and the political corruption in the Philippines. Furthermore, Rizal created a reform group in 1892 called the Liga Filipina and helped initiate the civil rights movement for all Filipinos. His peaceful attempts, however, were not well received by Spanish authorities, ultimately leading to his public execution for sedition in 1896 at Manila, the day before New Year's Eve. Following Rizal's death was a series of Filipino revolutions and new heroes that emerged. Andres Bonifacio, Emilio Aguinaldo, Marcelo del Pilar, and Apolinario Mabini, to mention a few. Eventually came the 7 Years' War between Spain and other metropoles that led to the country's independence from Spanish rule.
But hold on a second. Instead of letting Filipinos govern their homeland, the Philippines was sold to the United States for $20 million under the Treaty of Paris in 1898.
Oh.
Whether we're conscious of it or not, the Spanish colonial era left a pretty big mark on the way Filipinos now live and perceive themselves. This contemporary mindset that is based on American and European ideals of beauty and civilization is referred to as the colonial mentality. And it is so prominent in Filipino society that many feel ashamed of their pre-colonial Filipino features, stretching as far as bleaching their own skin to replace their inherently darker complexion for a fairer one. There is also this sense of colonial debt in which they feel as though they should accept the trauma and assimilation that was put upon them by the Spanish Empire, that the cost was worth it for this idea of progress and civilization. It was hard for our ancestors to keep their cultural integrity, especially when they were forced to learn a completely different culture. Despite such an oppressive era, the Philippines remained strong as it did fight for their independence and freedom from the Spanish Empire. But this wouldn't be a 3-part series if there wasn't another storm coming.
The Colonial Philippines series ends in the next episode. We'll be talking about a new emerging colonial era and the impact of World War II in the Philippines. If you like our content, go ahead and subscribe and share some love on this video. Are there any other Filipino topics that you'd like us to focus on? Go ahead and comment them down below. Stay in touch by following us on Instagram and Facebook at Focus Concordia. All relevant links will be down in the description box. We hope to see you again very soon. Mabuhay!